Imagine you are the most powerful nation on earth. Your economy is the largest in history. Your military budget exceeds the next 10 countries combined. Your corporations dominate global markets. Your currency is the world's reserve. And yet, on a cold morning in early 2026, your president sits down at a desk and drafts a request. Not a demand, not a threat. A request to the leader of a country you have spent the last 5 years publicly dismissing, tariffing, threatening to absorb as the 51st state. And the request is this: please fix our railways. Not with a loan, not with a technology transfer, not with a joint venture. $540 billion worth of Canadian railway assistance, technology, logistics expertise, financing, operational capacity. America, the nation that built the Transcontinental Railroad, that mobilized the greatest industrial effort in human history, that landed men on the moon and connected a continent with steel and steam, cannot run its own trains. And when the Canadian Prime Minister responds, he does not offer sympathy. He does not offer modified terms. He does not offer a payment plan. He offers to take over. Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, operational control of key American freight corridors, Canadian management of American passenger rail systems, Canadian expertise running the infrastructure that American institutions have proven incapable of operating effectively. And then he says the 7 words that will be studied in diplomatic academies for the next 50 years. This is not annexation. This is professional management. 70 million views in 12 hours, translated into dozens of languages, analyzed by every serious infrastructure economy on Earth. Professional management. The phrase is devastating not because it is aggressive, because it is true. Today, we're not talking about fighter jets or aluminum tariffs or potash exports. We're talking about something more fundamental, more humiliating, and more revealing than any of them. We're talking about the moment the United States asked Canada to run its infrastructure, and Canada agreed on its own terms. This is the story of the $540 billion railway rescue that wasn't. The story of how American deregulation, short-term profit extraction, and political theater finally collided with Canadian long-term planning, institutional competence, and quiet confidence. And the story of how professional management became the most devastating critique of American governance since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because when you have to beg your smaller neighbor to operate your trains, you are no longer a superpower. You are a client state. Let's be clear about what actually happened here. The official framing from the White House was characteristically Orwellian: a continental railway security partnership, a neighborly cooperation framework, a mutually beneficial infrastructure arrangement. This is nonsense. What actually occurred was a bailout request. The United States freight rail network, once the envy of the world, is in advanced stage collapse. Not sudden collapse, the kind that makes headlines. Erosion, collapse. The kind that happens slowly, quietly, invisibly, until one day the system simply stops functioning at the level required by a modern economy. Consider the evidence. Class 1 railroads. The giants like Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, Norfolk Southern have spent the last 30 years optimizing for shareholder returns, not operational resilience. Maintenance deferred, track quality degraded, workforce reduced, technology investment starved. Precision scheduled. Railroading, a management philosophy focused on maximizing asset velocity and minimizing costs, was implemented with religious fervor. The result: higher operating ratios, higher stock prices, and lower service levels. Shippers report dwell times measured in days rather than hours. Grain elevators in the Midwest cannot load trains that don't arrive. Chemical plants in the Gulf Coast cannot ship product that isn't moving. Automotive assembly lines idle, waiting for parts that are sitting in rail yards 3 states away. This is not a cyclical downturn. This is structural decay. And passenger rail, Amtrak, is a separate but equally profound catastrophe. Billions in federal subsidies, decades of reform commissions, multiple reauthorization acts, and still the Acela, America's high-speed train, averages 68 miles per hour between Washington and Boston. Japan's Shinkansen, 1Herzi Meeresbay. France's TGV, 173, Germany's ICE, 162 or 68. Against this backdrop, Donald Trump looked at the Canadian railway system, CN and CP, operating with clockwork precision across the continent, moving record tonnages with minimal dwell times, maintaining infrastructure that actually supports the volumes demanded of it, and made a calculation. We cannot fix this ourselves. We need their help. We need to pay them $540 billion over 10 years to bring their technology, their expertise, their management systems, their institutional competence, and apply it to our crumbling network. This is not partnership. This is admission. And Mark Carney understood that instantly. The question put to Carney at the Montreal Transportation Conference was straightforward. How will Canada respond to President Trump's request for $540 billion in railway assistance? He could have said, "We're studying the proposal." He could have said, "Canada is always willing to cooperate with our American partners." He could have said, "We look forward to productive discussions." He said none of those things. Instead, he reframed the entire conversation. Canada is prepared to address American railway dysfunction through a comprehensive infrastructure management partnership. This would place Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Railway in operational control of key American freight corridors. Canadian transportation expertise would manage American passenger rail systems that American institutions have proven incapable of operating effectively. The room fell silent. Then the follow-up. Does this represent Canadian annexation of American infrastructure? And then the 7 words. This is not annexation. This is professional management. Let's analyze why this response was so strategically devastating. First, it accepted the premise of American failure. Carney did not dispute that American railways are dysfunctional. He did not offer condolences or express concern. He agreed. Implicitly, explicitly, unmistakably. American institutions have proven incapable of operating effectively. That is not a diplomatic statement. That is a verdict. Second, it redefined the relationship. Trump's request assumed Canada as a supplier, providing inputs to an American-managed system. Carney's response repositioned Canada as the operator, managing the system itself. This is not a higher price. This is a different category of relationship. Third, it weaponized competence. The phrase professional management contrasts directly with the implied alternative: amateur mismanagement, political theater, institutional incompetence. And because it is demonstrably true, because Canadian railways objectively outperform American railways on every relevant metric, there is no effective rebuttal. You cannot argue with facts. And that is why the clip went viral. Not because it was clever, because it was accurate. To understand why this moment was possible, we need to understand how American railways arrived at this point. The story begins in 1980 with the Staggers Rail Act. Deregulation saved the freight rail industry from bankruptcy. It allowed railroads to abandon unprofitable lines, negotiate confidential contracts with shippers, and price services based on market demand. For 20 years, this worked. Efficiency improved, rates declined, investment returned. Then something changed. The private equity model infiltrated the railroads. Hedge funds acquired stakes. Activist investors demanded cost reduction and share buybacks. The time horizon compressed from decades to quarters. Precision scheduled railroading, PSR, became the dominant operating philosophy. Developed by E. Hunter Harrison at Illinois Central, refined at CN, exported to CP, CSX, Norfolk Southern, and Union Pacific. PSR is a brilliantly efficient system for extracting maximum asset utilization. Trains run longer, heavier, and less frequently. Crews are consolidated, yards are closed. Maintenance is deferred to the absolute minimum required for safe operation. And it works if your goal is maximizing operating ratio and stock price. It does not work if your goal is moving the nation's freight reliably. Shippers report. Service failures that strand time-sensitive cargo. Inconsistent schedules that undermine just-in-time manufacturing. Capacity shortages during peak seasons. Ride increases that exceed inflation while service quality declines. The Surface Transportation Board, the federal agency responsible for economic regulation of railroads, has proven utterly incapable of addressing these problems. Its processes are slow, its remedies are weak, its political independence is compromised. And the passenger rail situation is even worse. Amtrak is structurally designed to fail. It is expected to operate profitably on routes that no private sector entity would ever serve. It lacks its own infrastructure outside the Northeast Corridor, operating on tracks owned by the freight railroads that view passenger trains as obstacles to be minimized. Its capital funding is appropriated annually, making multi-year planning impossible. This is not a funding problem. This is a governance problem. And it has been building for 40 years. Now, contrast this with Canada. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific are not government-owned. They are private corporations, publicly traded, subject to the same shareholder pressures as their American counterparts, and yet they operate differently. Why? Part of it is history. CN was a crown corporation until 1995. Decades of public ownership instilled a culture of infrastructure stewardship that survived privatization. CP, while always private, operated in a competitive environment that rewarded reliability as much as efficiency. Part of it is geography. Canada's east-west trade corridor, constrained by the Canadian Shield and the Rocky Mountains, requires cooperation. The railways learn to work with each other, with their customers, and with the government. Part of it is policy. The Canadian Transportation Agency maintains meaningful oversight of rail service. The government has invested in rail infrastructure, not just subsidies, but institutional capacity. Via Rail Canada's passenger service is not a commercial success, but it operates with professionalism and predictability. And part of it is simply competence. When Canadian Railways implemented precision scheduled railroading, they did so with attention to service outcomes, not just financial metrics. They maintained their track, they invested in technology, they retained skilled workforces. The result is not just better performance. The result is that when the United States realized it could no longer operate its own railways, Canada had the institutional capacity to offer a credible alternative. That is not luck. That is strategy. Let's talk about the number itself. $540 billion. Over 10 years. $54 billion annually. To put this in perspective, worth the entire annual budget of the U.S. Department of Transportation is approximately $90 billion. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 allocated $66 billion to rail over 5 years, about $13 billion annually. Trump's request represents 4 times the entire rail title of the IIJA every year for a decade. This is not infrastructure investment. This is a transfer payment. And here is the question that no one in Washington is asking. Where is this money going? Not to American railroads, not to American construction companies, not to American engineers or American laborers. To Canada, for Canadian technology, Canadian logistics expertise, Canadian management systems, Canadian operational control. $540 billion flowing north to fix a problem that American institutions created and American institutions cannot solve. This is not trade. This is not partnership. This is tribute. And Mark Carney's counter-offer, Canadian operational control of American infrastructure, is simply the logical extension of this reality. If you are paying Canada $540 billion to fix your railways, why shouldn't Canada run them? If American management has failed so completely that you must import foreign capacity at extraordinary cost, why retain nominal control over a system that you no longer control effectively? If Canadian railways are demonstrably superior, why accept second best? The question answers itself. This moment is not occurring in isolation. It is the latest and perhaps most humiliating episode in a pattern we have documented throughout this series. Trade. America imposed tariffs. Canada diversified its customers. Energy. America threatened pipelines. Canada built LNG terminals and expanded West-East transmission. Agriculture. America taxed potash. Canada signed long-term supply agreements with Asia and Latin America. Defense. America demanded F-35 loyalty. Canada reviewed the contract and offered to build Gripens. Minerals. America relied on Canadian aluminum. Canada discovered 1/3 of the world's alumina in Saskatchewan. And now, infrastructure. America begged for railway assistance. Canada offered to run the system. Each of these episodes follows the same arc. American policymakers, operating from assumptions of permanent dominance, treat Canada as a dependent satellite to be pressured, tariffed, dismissed. Canada, operating from quiet realism, systematically builds alternatives, not through confrontation, through competence, through long-term investment in institutional capacity, through strategic diversification of markets and supply chains, through the patient accumulation of capabilities that, when needed, can be deployed at scale. And then, at the moment of crisis, when American assumptions collide with American reality, Canada is ready. Not triumphant, not vengeful. Ready. And the world is watching. Every middle power, every allied nation, every country that has built its defense and economic planning around the assumption of American reliability is now reassessing. If the United States cannot run its own railways, what else can it not do? If the United States must beg its smaller neighbor for infrastructure rescue, what other dependencies remain hidden? And if Canada can credibly offer to manage American critical infrastructure, what does that say about the distribution of institutional competence on this continent? These questions are not theoretical. They are being asked in Berlin, Tokyo, Seoul, London, Canberra. And the answers are reshaping global perceptions of American power. This brings us to the most significant strategic development to emerge from this episode: the professional management doctrine. Mark Carney did not improvise those 7 words. They were deliberate, they were calibrated, and they represent a fundamental shift in how Canada will engage with American and institutional failure going forward. The old model, Canada offers supplemental support to American-led systems. The new model, Canada offers superior alternatives to American-dominated systems. This is not anti-American, it is post-American. It recognizes that the United States, for all its remaining strengths, is no longer the undisputed leader in every domain of modern governance. In transportation, in healthcare, in election administration, in infrastructure planning, there are now countries that do it better, and Canada is one of them. This is not arrogance, it is evidence. When your passenger trains average 68 miles per hour and Canada's average 100, you are not the leader. When your freight railways require $540 billion in foreign assistance to function, you are not the leader. When your ambassador tells the world, we don't need Canada, and then your president begs Canada to run your trains, you are not the leader. The professional management doctrine simply states this reality out loud, not to humiliate, to clarify. And clarification is necessary because the gap between American self-perception and American institutional performance has become so vast that it threatens rational decision-making. You cannot fix a problem you refuse to acknowledge, and you cannot acknowledge a problem when your political culture punishes acknowledgement as weakness. Canada has no such constraint. It can state the truth because the truth is its competitive advantage. This is not annexation. This is professional management. The truth. So where does this leave us? The $540 billion request is not going away. The dysfunction it was meant to address is not resolving itself. American railways will not magically regain competence because Donald Trump asked nicely. Something will have to change. Either the United States will undertake a decades-long, multi-trillion-dollar effort to rebuild its transportation institutions from the ground up, an effort for which there is currently no political consensus, no sustained funding stream, and no operational blueprint, or it will accept Canadian management of its critical infrastructure, not as a temporary emergency measure, as a permanent structural arrangement. And if that occurs, if CN and CP assume operational control of key American corridors, if Canadian expertise becomes embedded in American rail operations, if the professional management doctrine becomes continental policy, what else will Canada manage? American air traffic control, American port operations, American cybersecurity, American healthcare administration. Where does it stop? The question is not hypothetical. It is the logical endpoint of a trajectory that began with NAFTA, accelerated through decades of integration, and has now reached a crisis point where the smaller partner has demonstrably superior institutional capacity in critical domains. Canada does not seek this role. It did not campaign for it, but it is prepared for it. And that preparation, the quiet, systematic, multi-decade investment in operational excellence, long-term planning, and institutional competence, is the only reason this conversation is possible. The tragedy for America is that it could have done the same. It chose not to. It chose shareholder returns over system resilience, political theater over professional management, short-term optics over long-term capacity, and now it faces the consequences. Not in some distant future, today. On its failing tracks and delayed trains and crumbling infrastructure, with a $540 billion invoice from the country it spent 5 years dismissing, and a simple, devastating offer. We can run this for you. Professionally. There is a photograph that every Canadian railway executive knows. It shows the last spike at Craigellachie, British Columbia, 1885. Donald Smith, director of the Canadian Pacific Railway, driving the iron spike that completed the first transcontinental railroad in Canada. The photograph is black and white, formal, Victorian. But it captures something essential about the Canadian character. The railroad was not an economic necessity. It was a political imperative. A young country, vast and sparsely populated, connecting itself with steel and steam because the alternative, absorption into the American continental system, was unacceptable. Canada built its own railway because Canada needed to control its own territory. 141 years later, that railway is being offered to operate the American system, not through conquest, not through coercion, not through any of the mechanisms traditionally associated with great power competition. Through competence, through the quiet, patient accumulation of institutional capacity that Canada has pursued while America was distracted. Through the unwillingness to accept that good enough is good enough. Through the stubborn conviction that professional management is not a luxury but a necessity of modern statecraft. And now, when America finally realizes it cannot run its own trains, Canada is there. Not triumphant, not vengeful. Ready. The $540 billion request is on the table. The counter-offer has been made. The world is watching. And the question that will define the next decade of North American relations is not whether Canada can manage American infrastructure. It is whether America can accept being managed. What do you think? Was Carney's professional management response a brilliant strategic move or a diplomatic provocation? Can the United States ever rebuild its transportation institutions to match Canadian competence? And if Canada does assume operational control of American railways, what other infrastructure domains might follow? Let me know in the comments. If you want to track these infrastructure and governance shifts before they become headlines, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We're watching the signals the rest of the world misses.